It was a moment of being around with the olive trees, and among this silent moment. For Jesus, it was a place of silence and a place of solitude. He knew that the hour had come, and it was just after the Passover. He had instituted the Eucharist. He had washed the feet of the disciples. He had a moment to cherish the last moments with the ones he loved most. And he came to the garden. There was only one moment that he asked the disciples if they could stay awake and to pray, keep watch. He needed that support. He needed the companionship of the disciples, the one who had been with him for the longest time of his life. But sadly and silently, he fell asleep. We find ourselves at times when we enter into the spiritual lethargy of life. When you and I find ourselves in a moment in what I call dryness in our spiritual life. Some call it a state of laziness. It's a moment when you find yourself burned out and dried. Some of us find ourselves weak in our spiritual life. We're just having a conversation with a wonderful friend a couple of days back. You're saying, Father, this is the most challenging moments of my life. In my own spiritual life, in my relationship with God and people around me. I find myself challenged in every areas of my life. This is a moment when you find your passion and the energy of your faith, of your spiritual dimension at its very lowest moments. Some call this when the wells run dry. When you find yourself being asked to stay awake and to watch and to pray and to keep that moment of companionship, be in that moment with Jesus, and it's struggling. It's so dry, it's just empty, Father. Finding yourself sometimes just going once a week for Mass in the past was just a struggle at times. You're plagued, you're colored. The motivation is no longer there. You enter into a moment of boredom and depression. The whole experience of your life, and what you do is you fall asleep. I'm just trying to remember a beautiful story in the gospel. The daughter of Jairus was asleep, sick, and Jairus came up to Jesus and said, my daughter is ill, will you come and lay your hands? In the midst of the journey, when Jesus got to the house of Jairus, the servant stepped out and says, there is no need, the girl is dead. Jesus said, she's not dead, she's asleep. Sometimes you and I might find ourselves when our spirits, when we find ourselves against the wind of our spirits. There is a war that is taking place. There's a moment of wrestle that is taking place of what is happening in us. I invite you just for this evening as we begin this journey in the Garden of Gethsemane to find yourself in a spiritual lethargy. Even at this point when we're having this whole experience of MCO and we're all in our homes, we find ourselves deprived of a good number of the sacraments. The sense of boredom and passion is dying. When will it end, Father? When will I return back to the church? When will I have my community? It's not working, Father. It's a whole decreased lack of energy, and we fall asleep. And as you find yourselves in this experience, we find ourselves stepping into the whole second experience of our lives. And this is when we realize when things are not working well for us, we find ourselves entering into the garden. And then Judas steps in with a cohort of soldiers with swords. Something is about to happen which will break the whole human relationship between Jesus and Judas at that night. Calling in mind that Judas was with Jesus in the upper room. He went down on his feet and he washed the feet of Judas. He kissed him. Be part of me. He gave them the Eucharist at table. Jesus was the master, the mentor. He was his teacher. It was at this juncture betrayal stepped in. It was a very painful moment, my dear friends. I do believe, as I am with you this evening, it was the night of betrayal. We all have our own share of experiences of human betrayal. It has occurred at some part of our lives. When someone who has sworn to give you that moment of confidence and confidentiality, that is taken away. The human trust is shattered and broken. What happens at that moment? It's a moment you take a moment to ask yourself, regardless of whatever happens, that relationship has been tainted and tarnished and it's broken. Judas Iscariot. We take it for a moment and ask ourselves, what was the intention that lay behind the mind of Judas when he looked for the 30 pieces of silver? Because as we know, each of our intentions is always shaped and colored by our motivations. Was it the money? Was it the fame? Was it the position or the power that he was seeking for? Was the inklings that were stirring at the depths of his heart? Was it that made him sell his master and teacher and mentor for 30 pieces? The relationship was broken, unfaithfulness and infidelity. I found myself yesterday when I was reading the Passion of the Gospel of Matthew yesterday. And then you remember that beautiful part of the narration, of the narrative of the Gospel of Matthew. At the betrayal of the announcement of Judas, Jesus said, one of you about to betray me. Everyone in that room, all the disciples echoed one word. Is it I, Lord? Is it I? Maybe it's an invitation for us this evening. That stillness of that silence in that garden. During these days, just to ask ourselves if it's I, Lord, if it's I, Lord. Let's stir the depth of our conscience tonight. The moments in our relationships with individuals that we have hurt. When we find ourselves the inability to forgive of someone who has betrayed us. Someone who has taken us for granted in that relationship. Someone who's left us isolated in the stillness of that darkness. We walk into that moment of that meditation to be betrayed. Jesus knew his betrayer was. Jesus waited for that moment if Judas would make that change of mind. Jesus was patient with Judas till the very end. May we allow ourselves tonight just to sit with this whole experience of being betrayed. The one we loved most. The one we treasured and cherished most. In the midst of this commotion, in the midst of this struggle between cohorts who came with swords and clubs to arrest Jesus, there was a moment of violence. One of them, Peter, took the sword, an eruption and a violence in the stillness of darkness. We take a moment and we ask ourselves, what's happening in the home front? What's happening in our community today? I was just reading a few days back, of a very interesting article They find that today, in the midst of this COVID pandemic and MCO, there's a surge, there's a spike of violence against domestic violence. It's never justified when something happens inside the home. Whatever violence it is, my dear friends, in any form, physical, sexual, psychological, it's a crime in every form that we can speak of today. Today, when we speak about violence in our society, when we speak of violence in our community, it transcends all ethnic, gender, social, economic, and religious boundaries. It steps into us. I find that it's sometimes when someone who's trying to exert the use of power to control another person, many forms today of this violence, I find it intimidation. When you begin to use the very threat of violence by a constant verbal abuse at home, the harassment that you use upon someone, you have the excessive possessiveness of the language that we use, when there's a deprivation of the physical resources to someone, it's taken away from that person. Take a moment, my dear friends. There was a stirring of violence, the scene of narrative. It is a moment when you and I have to regard ourselves, a moment to seek. There is a member of anger, of vengeance, of wrath that lies in the depths of our hearts. Take a moment, my dear friends, and to look at this whole scenario of the different forms of violence that we face today. We exploit someone of the self-esteem. In the midst of that violence, Peter took out the sword. He did something. Take a moment if you could remember that words. Put your sword back into its scabbard. When Peter was able to take that sword in the moment of violence to cut off the ear of the servant Malchus. It's a very symbolic moment, my dear friends, because it's what I call a communication cut at that moment. The saying in life, we all talk, but we do not listen. A very common phrase. We struggle with it today. In the past weeks, when we've been looking at the gospel text, when Jesus was having this heated dialogue with the Pharisees and the scribes and the church and the leaders of his time, it was always a reaction from the people and never a response. It was a cut in the whole experience of communication. We speak about the value of communication today. We speak about effective communication today, and we speak about the lack of communication today. We speak about connecting to one another today. Somehow this communication has been cut by that violence. There's a whole breakdown in that communication today. What comes to my mind at this moment is this beautiful scenario of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus was making his way there to engage himself with a dialogue with the Samaritan woman. And there was a whole series of taboo and whole series of cultural setbacks which Jesus was not able to engage himself. She was a woman, she was a Samaritan. Jesus was a man, he was a Jew. There was a split, there was a dichotomy, a gulf that was taking place, a barrier before the gulf, the whole experience of the communication. And I find ourselves in this bumpy road of communication today. As I said, we speak, but do we listen? Because sometimes when we speak, we reveal ourselves. We are afraid to reveal ourselves in this communication with others. We put ourselves in these injunctions, block ourselves from revealing, because God reveals himself. Sometimes we are afraid to reveal ourselves to one another. Jesus took his time in this whole dialogue experience with the woman at the well. He was patient with her. He allowed her to engage himself in different stages at different levels. And ultimately, he made her a part of that discussion of that thirst, of that water, of that living water, of that quenching moment. It's good for us today, my dear friends, as we continue this meditation, in the midst of our meditation of the garden narratives, of the intensity of darkness, of the symphony of sin. It's good for us to see and ask ourselves, even at this moment, I'm just trying to look at this moment in this COVID pandemic, and when we are at home together with our families, what's happening in our rooms? What's happening in the kitchen? What's happening in the living hall? Are we just engaged with ourselves, with our social media? Are we taking a moment to ourselves? This is a grace moment. It's a moment when we could just take a moment and ask ourselves, maybe this is a moment of opportunity for us to re-engage or rekindle that flame of that communication, that family life today. Maybe I've been hurt. I won't negate that. Sometimes you and I can't be offline all the time. Even at this moment, you and I are online. We need to find ourselves, if we could just step out of a vibrating mode or a silent mode, to walk into a conversation of communication with someone and build that effective. It's issues, even to the fact that we are speaking today of social distancing. Do we need to distance ourselves in the communication? Pick up a phone and to make that call to someone whom we know is lonely, someone who is isolated, someone who is seeking a comfort moment or a consolation in this moment of loneliness. Have we cut that communication in that area? Sometimes you and I have to really find ourselves at that moment to look at it. I take you now to another scene, my dear friends. Another scene that's very much a part of our lives today. If you get a moment tomorrow morning, and if you're attending Mass online, or if you're doing your spiritual reading tomorrow, I ask you to take a moment to look at the Gospel tomorrow. It's the Gospel of John. It's a beautiful narration or narrative, the Gospel of John. It's a conversation Jesus is having with the disciples about the hour. And he tells the disciples, you cannot follow me where I'm going. And Peter stands up and among the others and he says, Lord, I want to know where you're going. I want to be with you. And Jesus tells him, you won't be able to do that, guys. And Peter makes a very profound statement. He says, Lord, I will be there. I will be there, and I make this oath with you. I make this promise with you. I will be with you till the end. Say what, Lord? I will be with you till the end. And when the moment came, my dear friends, they ran for their lives. They took cover, as we said, one for oneself, oneself. Everything dispersed and everyone ran for themselves. It's what I call today spiritual indifference. We see many things. When the hour comes, my dear friends, when the hour calls us to make a stand, when a moment comes for us to call, we take a run for it. Some call this an indifference of blindness. Come back to what's happening today, my dear friends. That's a whole spectrum of a whole litany of things that's happening at the very front of our society today. It's in the media today. It's in every corner. And sometimes when we walk to the mall, when we get to the supermarkets, we are rushing for ourselves, my dear friends. We turn a blindness to the sufferings of what's happening around us. We lose the capacity to see what's happening around us because we don't want to carry the burden of others upon our shoulders. We fail to see, we fail to feel the unseen tears of others. It's a very pain part of life, my dear friends. I think this spiritual indifference running for oneself and saving oneself, hiding from one's end. It's a sad part of life. When we see something happening around us, do we speak up? Do we make our voice heard at that given moment? Or do we turn a blind ear or a deaf ear to what's happening around us? A very strong sign of selfishness. I'm not my brother's keeper. I'm not my sister's keeper. Sometimes we feel it's a grace moment. It's a given opportunity moment for us to just take a moment and we go back to that garden and we look at the scene of the disciples who are running to save themselves. It became a self-centered experience. It was the I. It's about the me. We do it very often, my dear friends. As I said, it's at this given moment. Sometimes we walk into a supermarket or even to the daily market, and all you have to do is just to look at the whole human behavior. It's a challenging experience, my dear friends. We live in a culture of indifference today. It's a whole culture of indifference. To me, my dear friends, I find that it's a lack of awareness. It's a lack of awareness. A lack of awareness of what's happening. I'm just trying to bring myself to a beautiful gospel text. The story of Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man had everything to his human contentment. And at his gate was Lazarus, the poor man. Lazarus had everything and nothing. Whatever scraps that fell, and the dogs were with him. When the moment of judgment came, it was a reversal of the whole scenario. I keep telling myself, it was not that the rich man was rich or he was blessed. It's nothing to do with that. It was just that he was self-contented with what he had. He was never allowed to step out of his gates. Many times I tell myself, we all have gates around us. We live in that comfort zone. Even at this moment, my dear friends, you could speak of the migrants, you could speak of the refugees, you could speak of whatever that's happening on the streets out now. We are able to step out of that moment and allow ourselves if I could make that difference today. It's a given moment in the garden for us to come to a sense of awareness. Dear friends, it's really, heat is on. I would say the heat is on. Its intensity is building up. As you go through these moments of your meditation on the whole narrative of the Passion, everything is unfolding in the garden. And if you remember the story of the garden, Jesus is arrested and he's brought before the Sanhedrin. He's brought before the chief priests, what I call the cream of the Jewish leaders, religious leaders. This group of people, they had their own agenda. They had their own ideas and intentions and dreams and plans. All they wanted to do was to get to Jesus. Did something which is very common in our human vocabulary today. It's called false accusations or false statements. We're not interested about the truth. Just ask you for a moment, sit back and ask yourselves, have you ever been falsely accused by someone? Have you been assaulted by words, accused with false statements? And we learn to do the same at this moment with the gospel text tonight. What were those false accusations that you could call to mind? Someone uses the motives and you've been misinterpreted, even misrepresented at that moment. When an unnecessary accusation has been brought before you and you're attacked at that moment, you have to understand these chief priests, these leaders were relentless. They just wanted Jesus badly, and they would go at any cost to get him with false statements. They were looking for the opportunity just to accuse him. They narrowed it down, and they narrowed it down because he had the influence. Jesus was able to capture the audience. He had the capacity to draw people. They were jealous with him. wanted to get him. My dear friends, when I look back at the journey of my life, the people that I've encountered in my life, I realize that sometimes false accusations are often unprovoked, unwarranted. It's just not there. It blocks us. It blocks people from stepping up in the ministry of the church today. It hinders them from doing God's work. Someone is stepping up in the work of the kingdom. Someone is striving so much to do for God's work. They become a barrier, a stumbling block, and not a stepping stone for someone. It hurts. It really hurts. This one individual or this community slowly sides away into the stillness of that silence. That's what false statements and accusations do. It's very painful. It's frustrating. It hurts. As I said to you, sometimes when I sit back for a moment, I try to digest, regress back into this whole experience of these accusations. I realize it's a place where selfishness and jealousy triumphs. Hurts and unhappiness triumphs. It's the darkness of the night. It's pride that takes over us. It's the stillness of the darkness of that night. Everything in the Gospel of John, as you will find on Good Friday, is about the darkness. Jesus would say, I am the light. Everything is happening in the darkness. And it becomes a tool to cripple someone into a state of insecurity, into doubts, into anxiety, into bitterness, into unforgiveness. Those are the moments, my dear friends. One of the most beautiful things, if you find yourselves tonight, is to read the 10 Commandments. It's in the 9th commandment. Thou should not bear false witness against your neighbor. It's there, my dear friends. And everyone in that stillness of the darkness brought that high moment to Jesus. It was a very sad experience. We continue our meditation, my dear friends. Peter was outside. He kept a distance. Peter was outside and he kept a distance. He was warming himself by the fire. He followed Jesus from a distance. And the moments came for him to make that stand. He put on a defense mechanism. He just stood up and put up his defense mechanism. I have no knowledge of this man. I don't know him. I am not one of his disciples. I swear I have no knowledge of him. It's a moment when we lose the responsibility that is entrusted to us on our faith. We all do it, my dear friends. When we are at the crossroads of our lives, when our faith is at the T-junctions of our lives, we find ourselves repressing ourselves. We find ourselves rationalizing our faith and finding a way to escape from it. It's what we call today in psychology, a reaction formation. We try to do the opposite of the unconscious. We try to escape from it. We either fight it, we either freeze or we are frozen, or we fright and run from it. Peter did all three that night. He put on that defense mechanism. We do it in many ways, my dear friends. We stay away. Whenever there's something that confronts our faith in the truth that will set us free, we avoid the truth. We take the easier way. Two roads diverge in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by. That has made a difference. Words of Robert Frost. And very often we take the wider ones and not the narrow ones, because we don't want to be accountable for the price that we have to pay. Standing up for our faith, speaking up for that faith. We do it very often, my dear friends. As I draw closer, my dear friends, I find myself tonight in the shoes of a very, very interesting personality. I ask you tonight to find yourself in the shoes of this wonderful man. Many a times we negate, put ourselves in his shoes. We find him as the criminal of the gospel. We find him as the betrayer. We find him as the one who stirred up the whole experience and the darkness of sin. Judas was at the end of his rope at that night. He didn't at any moment realize that the consequences of his doing would end him at this point. He was what I call today a sense of despair. He was in total despair, my dear friends. He wanted to make a change. He wanted to make the U-turn. He had no way. He found himself at the end of the rope. Today, when I speak of this, my dear friends, I find myself in my work with many young people today at the end of despair, in depression, in desperate moments of life, and they end up in self-injury and self-harm. This moment of self-injury and self-harm can lead one to suicide. It's a moment when we inflict pain upon ourselves. Judas committed suicide. There was no way out for him. Because whenever there is a moment of despair, it leads to human destruction. Self-harm, my dear friends, I have to be honest with you. Self-harm is a way we heal ourselves. That's what someone who's an alcoholic or an addict would do himself. It's a way I'm healing myself. It's a way I'm numbing my pain. It's a way I'm dealing myself. It's a coping mechanism, Father. It's a way that I can just deal with myself at this point. I can't stand with myself. I'm disgusted with what I've done. The sense of shame at his moment. To put it in a very simple English, my dear friends, it's a guilt that we all carry. It's a guilt that we carry. I remember the narration of Genesis chapter 3. It's a beautiful scene of Adam and Eve. The story of the temptation, we had it the first week of Lent, the first Sunday. In the midst of committing the sin, they realized they were naked. They hid themselves. That's shame. That's guilt. It's a moment when you look for redemption. I once remember these beautiful words from a wonderful young woman who was injuring herself in self-harm, and she said this: every time I cut myself, Father, I'm trying to save myself. It was a spiritual way of escaping from the truth. Sometimes in this moment, my dear friends, of our loneliness, in the moments of our pain, in our agony, how do we deal with ourselves? How do we cope with this pain of loneliness and abandonment? How do we numb the pains of healing our pain? Where do we turn the medicine, seek that comfort, the solace, and the healing touch of God's presence? Where do we turn to? Where do we find this human antidote in this moment of our pain? I come now, my dear, for the last moment of that whole agony. Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate. He was the picture of the Roman Empire. That's how Pilate was. He saw the innocent in Jesus. He knew he couldn't do much. The pressure was building up for him. He was caving in. And so, because of the pressure that was building up, he didn't want to take the responsibility, left it back to the crowds. He avoided the responsibility. This is what we call today the abuse of power. The abuse of power. I've heard this beautiful saying: absolute power corrupts absolutely. Those who are in positions, for those who are in positions and power, it can be a challenging moment to be a selfish act and desire, because it stems from the sin of the human nature. Because it's all about control and influence. That's what Pilate fell in. It was a whole drama of politics that was unfolding to him. We find the scene, my dear friends, in our family today. At times we find it even in church institutions. St. John the Baptist had to confront Herod the Tetrarch. He became the mouthpiece. The prophets saw this in the Old Testament. He became the mouthpiece to speak up Sometimes the abuse of power can be when one begins to believe, take advantage of another person. It becomes a power in an absolute and abusive way. As I said to you, my dear friends, it comes in many forms when we begin to use this power to gain access for information. We use the power to be able to control someone or a community. When we begin to use the power to manipulate someone, the selfish needs, but even at times when we use this power to punish someone, we saw it happening. It still happens, my dear friends. My dear friends, it's the symphony of sin. The past days have been good to one of us as we find ourselves in this pandemic of COVID-19. So much is unfolding before us, my dear friends. So much, as I said to you, it's unprecedented moment of life that's unfolding to us, this digital age. It's how we have been using ourselves to communicate to one another. There was betrayal, there was a sense of indifference, there was a spiritual lethargy. There was a moment of violence, there was a moment of defense mechanism. There was moments of false accusations. There was a moment of defense, abuse of power. It all unfolded on that night. You will find yourselves on Holy Thursday. You will find yourself on Good Friday, on the passion and the death of Christ, and yet we believe in the resurrection. I invite you, my dear friends, as you walk from Galilee to Jerusalem, fixing your eyes into Jerusalem, I ask you to find your moments to reach the Jerusalem of your heart. It lies there, my dear friends. The hour will come. The hour has come. The whole experience of Lent is drawing to a close. I invite you to step into the Jerusalem of your heart. My only words to you as I end this evening with you is to invite you to stay safe, to stay healthy, and to stay awake with the Lord during these days. It's a grace moment. Find that stillness in that silence of the garden, just to meditate upon this moment of the different array and spectrum of sins that unfold before us. God will speak to us. He will allow us to enter into that stillness of the night, to find that moment. I thank you all for being with me tonight. And I hope to see you again on Wednesday as we take a moment to be into the garden, staying awake with God. Good night and God bless. Simon, if you'd like to make the concluding remarks, I'm finished at this moment.
Okay, good. I will. So thank you everyone for joining us today. The next stop will be on this Wednesday. You will have to use the Wednesday meeting ID. The password will remain the same, which is CHS123. Again, God bless you all. Stay home and stay safe. Good night.